everybody, and welcome again to the Trenasol podcast, where we're trying to make the Great Commission every church's mission, every Christian's passion. I'm here with my co-host, Bill DeYoung, and today we're going to be interviewing Bernard Westerveld, Pastor Bernard Westerveld, and we're going to be talking about theological education and the mission of the church. So by means of introduction, grew up in the CRC, ended up doing his seminary training at Westminster, Philadelphia, where he got his MDiv, and then served for about 22 years as pastor evangelist of a French Reformed church in Quebec. And then just recently has become the principal of the Farrell Seminary in Quebec. And so comes to us with a whole wealth of knowledge of mission work and has been doing a lot of thinking about theological training and its relationship to mission. So welcome to the podcast, Ben.
Thank you, Winston. Good to see you, Bill.
Good to see you, Ben.
So if we want to tease out this question, what's the relationship between theological education and the mission of the church? And so Ben, we can talk to you about a bunch of different things. You're the principal of a seminary. You're involved in a publishing house in Quebec that's publishing theological books for people. You've worn numerous hats and done various things. But I want to go right back to your own seminary training. So if you can think way back to your own seminary training, did you find that your seminary training prepared you well to go work in mission? And if yes, how? And if no, perhaps why would you say that?
Yeah, I guess the short answer would be no. I was at Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. The program they had there, very good, very complete. However, I realized when I was taking the classes that there was a lack of emphasis on missions evangelism. So I actually looked for doing two things. One was just I took a course that was offered, an optional course on evangelism explosion. And my internship, particularly the second one, I particularly looked for a church planter of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church to work under in order to, if you will, fill a void.
All right. So it didn't help you mission-wise just because it didn't have a focus on mission in terms of content of the content of what courses were offered or what was going on in any particular course?
Yeah, probably both, in the sense that the courses that were required, there was nothing, I wouldn't say it's nothing again. I'd have to relook at all the courses I took, but or required courses. Recollection, there was nothing that was specifically missions, nor was missions integrated into the courses in general, other than maybe an occasional comment or anecdote that was given by the professor. So that's where particularly as I already had a heart for early on in my program, my first year of studies, I had a heart to go to Quebec, and knowing it was a mission field, I sought out those kinds of classes. So evangelism explosion. I also actually took a course on contextual theology with the late Harvey Kahn. So those were classes that were optional that I sought to fill out the void.
So Bill, you went to a different seminary. What would your answer be to that question? Do you think your seminary education prepared you for mission work?
No, I don't think it did. I think I had one course in my seminary curriculum, a 3-year program called Evangelism and Missions, and that was about the extent of it. And I don't think that the solution is necessarily to offer specific courses in this. I actually think that mission is something that should be weaved into every course that is taught at a seminary, but it just wasn't very much on the horizon. And I think it's largely because the professors there imagined us going into contexts that were largely Christianized, and it wasn't that common back then to think of North America itself as a mission field. When we talked about missions, it was largely foreign missions that we had in mind. And now I think there's a bit of a change in mindset, and we realize that we're on mission terrain here wherever we find ourselves in North America.
Yeah, I like how you put that there's a difference between saying, oh, you get a seminary education where you get X number of courses on mission related topics versus you get a seminary education where sort of missional thinking is sort of integrated or woven through, everything that you're doing. That was my experience. And that was one of the things that attracted me to Farrell. A bunch of years ago, I went and visited the Canadian Reformed Seminary. I went and researched Philadelphia, Westminster. I, looked at Regent College in Vancouver. I was looking at various options. And then I went up and visited the Farrell Seminary and interviewed or chatted, had some coffee with a couple of professors and noticed right away that everything that they were talking about was somehow related to, well, then how does this make sense of all of these people walking around in Montreal, and how do we reach these people? And then that certainly turned out to be my experience. I mean, at Farel, I took numerous mission courses, but mission tended to be woven through everything that we did. I mean, I remember my Old Testament prof ending every class and saying, okay, so now what we studied today, how does that relate to mission work? How does that relate to preaching? How does that relate to reaching people? So yeah, I don't know, Ben, would you now, after all of these years, agree with Bill saying that when it comes to seminary, it needs to be woven through, or would you say, no, but we also need to add a whole bunch of things on the list?
Good question. I guess as I think about it too, I guess we shouldn't neglect the fact that there were courses in apologetics. Now I know it's missions in terms of presentation, and Westminster had a strong program in apologetics, taken from the heritage of Cornelius Van Til. But yeah, the answer, I think you need both. I would say obviously it has to be integrated into all the classes. If I take counseling, Christian counseling, for instance, that's something which I took some specific classes in counseling. CCEF, Christian Counseling and Education Foundation, was associated with Westminster Seminary, and I was able to take some supplementary classes. Again, on the other hand, it would be very helpful if counseling was integrated into systematic theology, into biblical theology classes as well. So I think the same thing can be done with missions. But sometimes you need to step back and just look strictly, what is missions? How do you do missions? How do you do evangelism? How do you plant a church? So I would say you need both.
Yeah, I think you're probably right, Ben. Let me ask you this question.
You know I'm right, Bill. Come on.
Of course you are. How did you get up to speed then? So you landed in Quebec. You probably didn't even realize that your theological education was deficient at that point, but at some point you had to learn. And what did that consist of? Just meeting people, talking to them, asking them questions, or did you give yourself a kind of reading list and become an expert on your own?
Well, I definitely want to say I'm an expert. I'm still learning. I admittedly often lack the courage and zeal of other brothers in the faith, brothers and sisters in the faith who are very zealous in terms of outreach. So still growing. I guess a couple different things. One, having grown up in the Christian Reformed Church, my family's now a United Reformed Church. That idea of missions evangelism, again, as you mentioned before, Bill, it's out there. It's in another world. It's not here locally. So just didn't grow up with that. And why exactly? But when I was at seminary and the desire to go to Quebec, I realized I needed to develop those gifts and skills. So took the evangelism explosion course, made simple little steps already when I was in Philadelphia of doing some kind of outreach, seeking to be conscious of how to reach out to neighbors. So that was there. When I got up to Quebec, just a huge learning curve. Well, first of all, in terms of language. So just how do you communicate to someone in the French language, and really, how do you speak to heart issues when you can barely speak their language? And then Harvey Kahn, one of his advice that he gave me, you had to learn the language well, because if you don't speak their language well, you'll never reach their heart. So there was just learning the language, learning the culture, taking as much in about the Quebec culture as I could, both in terms of reading, watching movies, integrating, interacting with. So there was all those aspects, but also just in terms of my ministry, particularly as a pastor, being very conscious that I needed to give a significant portion of my time to outreach type activity.
So can I flip this whole thing on its head for a second? Now imagine there's a seminary that has all kinds of awesome mission courses, mission training, all kinds of practical related stuff, reads all the mission books, but that is almost all that they do. Then what would be deficient in that? Or to ask it another way, how, what is it about your own seminary education, you, Ben, and you, Bill, that actually did benefit you a lot, even though perhaps it wasn't specifically focused on mission?
Well, I would say that I benefited most from an internship I did also with an Orthodox Presbyterian church in downtown Chicago, where I was beating the pavement for a good part of the week, engaging people in a park, playing basketball. And by the way, if you're a Canadian playing basketball in Chicago, you are not the best player on the basketball court. So I think internships are very, very important here, because we learn to ask the right questions when our feet are on the ground. And there is, of course, value in courses and in textbooks and that sort of thing. But the same would be true of ministry in general. I wish we had a more integrated approach to seminary education, whereby individuals who are pursuing a seminary degree are also active to some extent in ministry. I wish that could be true of just your run-of-the-mill MDiv program, but I think that would be especially important for missional training, so that when you go to class, you know what questions to ask. So in short, the best part of my seminary education in relation to missions and evangelism was one internship in particular where I got a lot of exposure to it.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, Bill. The internships are very valuable in that sense. As I mentioned, I did this. My first intern was with more of established church. The second internship was more of a missional church. Bill Crispin, at the time an OPC pastor, very much involved in inner city missions. So that was his nature, just to be involved in missions and think missionally. In terms of seminary education, for me, I have always looked at seminary education as very much the foundation. They give you all the foundational languages, exegesis, hermeneutics, systematic theology, biblical theology, practical theology, but it's the foundation from which a man of God is going to build and develop. And I mean, I would pray that every pastor, evangelist is never stopping growing and wanting to learn more, and growing and learning to want more in terms of reading books, watching videos, and participating in conferences. But also when you're just on the ground and you're reflecting upon your ministry, how am I doing it? And what's God teaching me through this ministry? And how can I be better in doing what I doing in terms of the gifts God's given me?
So Ben, I want to chat a little bit about local church life and theological education. But before we go there, I'm thinking about J.I. Packer's book, Evangelism and the Sovereignty of God.
Mm-hmm.
That's a theological book, but it's a book that revolutionized the lives of numerous people that I've spoken to and helped them greatly in their mission work, because they had a theological foundation that made evangelism not anxiety driven or not fear driven. It gave them confidence in God. It gave them patience with people. It helped them to take a long view. It gave them confidence that they can see the Lord do miracles and do things. So when I think about that, I think about the non-mission specific theological training that I got in the doctrines of grace, for instance, that certainly helps you have when you're doing mission work in terms of grounding you or putting you on a strong foundation, like you mentioned, Ben, so that you can approach mission work in a balanced way and not in a sort of an odd way. We've all met people that are doing mission work with some crazy theology, and it comes out in how they go about doing mission work. And so, yeah, either one of you want to comment on that, because I think that's worth pointing out. It's you getting a good theological education, whether or not it's mission specific or not, does help you do mission work better.
Yeah, no doubt. Maybe just one comment. It's been a long time since I read Packer's book. Excellent book, a book that I've also recommended to my evangelical brothers and sisters just to read. As I recall, the book, Packer begins by saying, why do we pray when we do evangelism? Because we recognize implicitly or explicitly that it's God's sovereign grace that saves people. And so the beauty of Reformed theology, saying this is God's sovereign grace that saves people. I have a responsibility. I am engaged. I interact. I seek to use the best tools possible for presenting the gospel. But at some point, at every point, we're just immersing our evangelism in prayer. And I guess one of the greatest comforts I've had is there's been so many people I've had interaction with where, for whatever reason, because a person moved or they don't want to contact with me anymore, I can't reach them. I can't interact with them. So I just simply pray for them. I say, God, your spirit, it can go in places I can't go. So we leave that in God's hands, and I don't have to feel any sense of guilt because I didn't bring that person to a saving decision. I'd rather leave that in God's hands. So good theology, good prayer, and God's graces will bring them in His time.
Now, like Bernard, you've got 2 master's degrees. You're hoping to start a doctoral program. Bill, you've done your doctorate. You guys have done a whole bunch of higher education. Would you not say that higher education, as perhaps technical or sort of, it's higher education, do you think that would you say that it helps you mission wise, like Bill? So, you're involved in a church that's really trying to reach its neighbors. You've done your doctorate. Would you not say that higher education also helps you in that?
Absolutely. But I think learning of any kind helps you. And the only way I can be motivated to do any learning is if I'm in a degree program where I have assignments and deadlines. I'm not the kind of guy that can just say, okay, here are 15 books I'm going to read in the next, few months, like some people do. So I entered an advanced degree program in part to ensure that I continued to read and remain disciplined in reading, and I had all kinds of incentives to do that. But of course, when you learn, you enter into other worlds, you learn a new grammar and a new vocabulary and a new way of looking at things, and any kind of exposure that your mind gets is going to be helpful, I think, in the evangelistic enterprise or the missional enterprise. I mean, I suppose you could make a case that watching a lot of shows on Netflix will do the same, and maybe I should try that next time. But there is something about a growing body of experience and encounters that you have with people, learning about human nature, different vistas on humanity. All of that is going to enhance your missional potential. And it's in part because of my studies that I find I have more points of contact with individuals that I encounter on the street. And so that's been helpful. I don't know if there was anything in my degree program that was specifically helpful to the missional enterprise, but just the wide exposure to the world, kind of getting me out of the box in which I was located, was very, very healthy for me.
All right, guys, let's move it away from seminary education into, for the moment, we're gonna talk a little bit about Farrell in a bit, but let's talk about your experience as a pastor evangelist, Ben, in Quebec City. So when you think about your role as a pastor evangelist, leading that church, in some ways revitalizing that church, what role did theological education, not your own theological education, but the theological education that you're engaging with your church members or with other people, what was the role of theological education there?
The role of theological education in terms of engaging the members of the church, or
like the things outside the church, the things that you're teaching people in your church and outside your church about theology. Like I imagine you had, you were teaching people in your church, also teaching them theology in one way or the other. And I imagine also as you engage people who are, may or may not be interested in the faith, that there's also theological education or them asking questions that you have to engage and teach with, also plays a role in that. So thoughts on that in general.
Quickly, just a couple thoughts. One, just raising our covenant children in the faith. I mean, I don't like calling that evangelism. I don't ask my children to do the prayer or confession or give their life to Jesus, but we are raising our children in the faith so that the covenant promises they received at their baptism, signified at their baptism, they continue to live them out. And so we can never neglect that. It is unfortunately in our evangelical sister churches, they neglect that aspect of seeing their children as part of the covenant people of God. So that's one aspect. The other thing is, again, it's not directly evangelism, but just the number of people who come into contact with our church and appreciate a more solid biblical teaching, biblical, theological, thought out depth of teaching, which again, they have not always received in other churches, or even churches that they came from, which were reformed of heritage, but not necessarily active, how they've been able to grow in that theology because we have a church where we seek to be a church of depth. So just growing the body of Christ, I think that's part of the missional work. It's building them up so that when the members of the church are solid in their faith, even excited about their faith, they're going to be talking about it to other people, talking about it, particularly in our church context. Everyone has non-Christians in their families, in their neighborhoods, in their work context. There's very little Christian community around us. So they're talking about their faith with their neighbors and they're bringing people in. In some ways, I've said this before, I'm not a great evangelist, but the members of the church have brought people to faith because they invited them into the church community.
So, but let me ask a follow-up question there, Ben, about theological formation and that the role that played for you as a pastor. You were preaching from Sunday to Sunday. And, in the tradition of the continental Reformed churches, there were two services, a second service that was often a teaching service. There were midweek classes, church education classes. Did you have any opportunity to teach theology per se, independent of preaching from week to week? Was there any kind of curriculum for the church?
Well, the Sunday school program and also the catechism program. Usually, again, it was done on the Sunday. However, again, smaller congregation, working in a different context, I did a lot of one-on-one teaching. I rarely had a group, except for our youth growing up in the church. But even then, it was 2-3 individuals, just it's a small church context. But a lot of the new contacts we had, in the community were individuals coming from different backgrounds, and I just needed to engage with them one-on-one. So it was more time consuming, but more fruitful because I was able to interact with them with their questions, whether they came from a Roman Catholic background, nominal or active, or whether they came from we have several immigrants in our church that came from a different country, different church traditions. I needed to learn about their church because I didn't know their context, and then come alongside them and bring them up to speed in terms of some of our theology.
Bill, you've got a small group in your church that's mostly people that are new to the faith or are interested in Christianity. What's the role of theological education in that context?
Very good question, Winston. Well, so I have very little in the way of a curriculum for my small group, which is a very diverse group of people. Some are newly converted, and a good number are still exploring the claims of Christ. Some of those would identify as Christians, but I don't know that they really are Christians. They're kind of trying it on, seeing how it works. And so I focus simply on the Gospels. And every time we meet, we go through an episode in the life and the ministry of Jesus, and I teach from a passage from the Gospels. I suppose there are times when the teaching might be a little more theological than at other times, but that's an interesting question. So I suppose the theology that I'm imparting in my small group is derived straight from the text of Scripture, and it's Scripture that's kind of setting the course. And that's because I want people especially to become familiar with the person and work of Jesus. And in becoming familiar with the person and work of Jesus, you, of course, become familiar with the whole story of Scripture, because Jesus is always referring back to the Old Testament and so forth. So I suppose it's more biblical literacy that they're acquiring than theology per se.
Yeah, that makes sense. And at the same time, you're the one teaching it on purpose, right? Because you're the one who's got the theological education, and you can answer the difficult questions, and you'll be able to answer the theological questions. So, it's obvious that in whatever format it is, you are still engaged in theological education of some sort. How do we take that and go to what Ben had said, like equipping the saints for ministry? You said, the people in your church bring people to church. You've had, I imagine in your ministry, Ben, you had other people teaching classes as well. So how do we equip the saints to do? What kind of theological education do we need to give the saints so that they can do mission work?
That's a very good question. I'll answer. I've been thinking about this a lot because I have seen in the past, we've kind of encouraged some lay members of our congregation to lead Christianity Explored course, for example. And it didn't always go well because you always had one or two people that were asking these questions about the manuscripts of Scripture and so forth. You got to remember, people are on YouTube and they're searching, and so they'll come up with questions that a layperson may not be prepared to answer. And so I've been thinking more and more, Winston, about the need to equip individuals in the congregation for this kind of role. And I really think in my case, which is I pastor a sizable congregation, it's about finding probably 2 or 3 people to invest a lot of time in. I wonder if that's what pastors should be doing. We can't send everybody off to seminary, but maybe we can invest in 3 or 4 or 5 people and give them a kind of maybe informal seminary education so that they can play these kinds of discipling roles in the ministry of a congregation.
Got any comments about that, Ed?
Yeah. I don't think we need a lot of depth in terms of theological education in order to release people into the community to share their faith. In fact, they don't. They just need to share what they understand at their level of understanding. As I guess what's interesting is when someone gets asked a question, they don't have an answer, then they're encouraged to go look for the answer in order to respond to the non-believers. So there's a kind of they're feeding into each other as they're learning. I think for a lot of people, we just need to simply give them what are the basics of the gospel, things which they know already, but sometimes have a hard time articulating. Evangelism Explosion that I work with, and it has definitely its limitations and needs to be readapted, but it was very good. And here are the 5 points, about God, about you, about sin, about forgiveness, about new life. Here's the basics of the gospel. So getting those basics of the gospel repeatedly into the hearts and minds of the believers, the church members, so that when they are speaking to someone, they can share a word of hope that they have in Christ.
Ben, you are involved in something called Édition La Rochelle, which is a publishing house that's publishing stuff. Can you tell us what that's about and what's the purpose of it?
Good question. Yeah, Église La Rochelle actually is technically the name of the books, the line of books which a publishing house called Publication Chrétienne, a French publisher located in Trois-Rivières. They have several line of books, and going back about 10 years ago already, they offered to produce a line of books of Reformed conviction. So our committee chooses the books that are published or approves them. Sometimes we pay for the publication, the translation and publication. Sometimes it's other organizations that propose books and we give approval to them. Recently, Ligonier has been working with us, or us with Ligonier, whatever it is. They're publishing several of the works that they have, Marcy's Farrell and others. The primary goal is really getting the beauty of Reformed theology known in the French-speaking world. Authors like Tim Keller, Kevin DeYoung, and now R.C. Sproul, even Sinclair Ferguson, they're becoming big reads, big producers in terms of the French world, that people are buying those books up. And so we rejoice in that. Now, sometimes the books which are published from them are Reformed in its undergirdings, but not necessarily explicitly Reformed theology. And we're trying to get more of those kinds of books out there. We did a couple different works, but particularly Covenant Theology, the book from the late Reverend Clarence Stam, The Covenant of Love. We were able to raise money and publish that book in the French language. We have a couple other booklets on covenant theology, baptism, infant baptism. We're coming out with a book later this year on evangelism. Rico Tice, if I recall the name properly, Honest Evangelism. Just getting tools out there for the people so that they can have a deeper, richer theology from which they can live out a deeper, richer faith.
Okay, so that leads me to my question. So you're in Quebec. There's this tiny group of Christians. There's this tiny group of believers. Why invest all this time into translating theological books, for that province? Why not say, well, let's just take that money and use it to go, knocking on doors, or to be doing something that's, more stereotypical missional? Like, why do this?
Good question. I think on one end, because we are trying to do that very thing with us or other groups in terms of outreach. Our church here locally in Quebec City, we cooperate with a group called Aujourd'hui l'Espoir, Today, Hope for Today. And they're very much evangelism, the typical, just out there to evangelize, that's their goal. And so we seek to support them, work with them, and also the Eric Ayen, Reformed Faith and Life, his French podcasts are being broadcasted through them. However, I'm really convicted that we need to have the believers solidly anchored if they're going to stand as a light in this world. And if the believers themselves are not solid, how will they withstand the temptations of this world? How will they continue to be a light? They'll start flickering and becoming dim and even be burnt out. So there's a need just for them to be solid in the faith and be able to withstand the temptations of this world. And through that testimony, both in terms of what they believe, but also the way they live out their faith, they will become attractive and draw others in to say, well, why is your life and faith different? Why, for instance, why are you kind? Why don't you swear? Why are you thankful? Why do you have lasting relationships? Why do you pursue friends rather than just let the friendships sputter away? Why do you work hard? So those kinds of questions come up. And if believers can start answering, well, something in terms of their faith, how that impacts them, that will become first testimony.
Oh, I really like that. It's go, baptize, teach. But what you're saying is that the teaching sort of perpetuates sort of this mission cycle, because you get robust believers who live attractive lives in Christ, which helps further the mission. That's interesting.
Exactly.
Maybe one of you who know church history better than me, I think of the Reformation, you think how closely tied the Reformation was to the publishing of books and tracts. And it seems that where Reformed churches go, they publish good books and they publish things. So, and it makes me think of like when R.C. Sproul passed away, John MacArthur gave a eulogy, and he said, R.C. Sproul has been the tip of the spear for mission work in the last 100 years, primarily because from the beginning, he was the one making tapes and distribute published material. And so, in his eulogy, he said he's been the tip of the spear for mission work. So yeah, any of you, either you, Bill or Ben, want to comment on that? When we think about the mission work that we want to be doing today, whether that be locally or provincially, do we need to still be publishing things? Do we still want to be doing that? We can all publish your book.
I thought you were going to say nationally.
Nationally?
Yeah.
Bill wants to get his book.
Yeah, nationally for Quebec.
That's right.
No. Yes. I'm talking about the Quebec nation.
That's right.
Well, Winston's, he wants to see my book translated into French, because
maybe then we can understand it, because I can't understand it in English.
Maybe we should translate it first into English. Yeah, so the role that literature plays alongside of evangelism is interesting. And, it was the reformers who started producing catechisms. And it wasn't done in Catholicism. Catholicism had a different history in terms of education. But I do find it interesting to note how those catechisms have played a role in outreach, so that when people went to communities where the gospel was not known, they often taught the Lord's Prayer and the Ten Commandments and the Apostles' Creed as kind of the basics of the Christian faith. So I think we sometimes see the Reformation as a largely pedagogical or educational movement, and it certainly was, coincided, of course, with the invention of the printing press, and so all kinds of materials were disseminated. But among those materials, there were documents that were used for outreach purposes. And I'm a fan of catechism. I'm not sure how useful the Heidelberg Catechism is anymore in the enterprise of missions, only because it was so missional back then that it can't be overly missional now, which is to say it was very contextualized to its time, the way that a catechism should be. I wish we had better catechisms today that we could use, because I think the format is great to get in the hands of people. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Great Lakes Catechism on sexuality, but I think they did an excellent job with that. It's a production of a classis in the RCA. It's on sexuality, but they're asking exactly the kinds of questions people are asking, and then giving very concise answers. I think I see a lot of use in that.
What do you think about that, Ben? You teach a course about creeds and confessions at Farrell, so.
Yeah, no, I taught the course, the joy of discovering other confessions that are out there. And I love history. I tend to be a little one who loves going back to the old texts. So I think there's great value in studying some of these old texts, because it gives us a new perspective on today's culture. So that's a plus for keeping the old catechisms. And you can't beat the Heidelberg question and answer number one, particularly in a society where people are living solitude. To say that I belong to Christ, I think there's a response to a crying need in our society in that answer. At the same time, as Bill pointed out, we need something that's going to respond to the questions that we have today that are more grounded in our society and the questions that people have on a day-to-day basis. Coming back to scriptures and seeing how scripture responds to those day-to-day questions that we have. Again, I haven't developed enough tools in that sense, but that's something I would definitely like us to see develop more at Farrell. Publishing books, absolutely, but we also need to do more in the way of podcasts like you're doing here, videos, online conferences, or online courses that people can take. I think there's a venues that we are exploiting, and we need to exploit more.
Well, you mentioned Farrell. Let's talk a little bit about Farrell. You're the principal there. Here's my question. You got lots of people in Quebec that read English and could study in English. And why have a seminary in Quebec? Why not just get them to do some online or get them to go into an English place?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And we actually, particularly as a board, when I was on the board a few years ago, we wrestled with that question. We talked to the pastors of the ERQ about it, and there's different opinions on it. Some people would say, yeah, we can send our students down to an English-speaking seminary somewhere else, or even into France to the John Calvin Seminary in French-speaking. There is a conviction that we have, the majority of us at least, that it's best to be studying theology in the mission field that you're working in. And so, yeah, it's a little bit less exotic in terms of the number of professors that we have or courses that we can offer. But on the other hand, when you step out of the classroom, you're right in the mission field that God is calling you to prepare for. And I think there's a huge value in that. So that's what we want to see developing.
Before you get on, I want like that phrase, it's best to be studying theology in the mission field that you're working in. Mm-hmm. That's something worth meditating on. I don't know. Does that resonate with you, Bill?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, missions is largely about contextualization. And if you go out of your country to get a seminary education, you're not obtaining contextualization at all. So I think the best way to, I totally support this idea of having the Farrell Institute in Quebec, where you're going to get education and you're going to walk out the door and immediately be confronted with the context in which you're going to be ministering. I think that's exactly right. Otherwise, we detach seminary education too much from the work of pastoral ministry. We want as much as possible to keep those things together. And, everyone who's studying at the Farrell Institute is living in Quebec. They're reading the Quebec newspapers, as it were, talking to people. They're familiar with the questions people have, and all these things can be discussed at the well, I don't know if you have a cafeteria, but at tables at the Farrell Institute. If you go to RTS in Jackson, Mississippi, which is a fine institution, the culture there is very, very different. You're probably going to end up talking about American politics or something like that. And so I think it makes a lot of sense. And even as Ben said, it may not be as exotic. You may not have a very impressive building or a great roster of faculty. I still think in the end, it's the best thing for the church.
Okay, but I agree, and I think it works for Farrell. I mean, when I visited Farrell for the first time, I'd just come back from Africa. So, at that time it was in the old Fine Arts Museum building, the old one that's all been redone now. And I went in, it was like one classroom with a rickety table and a chalkboard that was like, leaning over. And I was like, this is awesome. This reminds me of, being on the mission field in Mali. That was an attractive thing for me. But you could say the same thing about our own Canadian Reformed Seminary in Hamilton is situated in the culture in which we ought to be on mission toward. But it's different when you're a very small minority within your culture, and your culture is more obviously a mission field. And then you have a seminary within that. Then it's sort of like you go and you step outside the door and you don't see any, churches around. You don't know very many Christians. So it works that way. But yeah, does it work when you have a seminary in Hamilton or a seminary in Toronto? Yeah. Do you hear where I'm going with that?
Well, there's the question, is it working, or ought it to work, or is it being done well, or should it be done better? I mean, personally, I wish we had a seminary education where you had individuals in the program who were also involved in part-time ministry. That, for me, is the ideal, in part because people generally discover whether they're called to ministry by being in ministry of some sort. And it's a great way for young guys to discover whether they're being called to ministry, for one, but then also to get an education in tandem with pastoral experience. So if I were in charge of the world, and everyone should breathe a sigh of relief that that's not the case, I would have a seminary where every student was simultaneously involved in some kind of pastoral ministry at the same time. I'm not sure what that would look like in every case, but certainly preaching, certainly meeting with people and that sort of thing. Otherwise, I just think it becomes too detached, and that's unfortunate and unproductive.
Yeah, I don't know. There's some assumptions in that too, Bill. Like if you're, there'll be students at Farrell where, none of their family are believers. None of their family are believers. None of their colleagues are believers. None of their school classmates are believers. The people that they grew up in the neighborhood are not believers. So, do they need to be doing part-time ministry on the side so that they're engaged in ongoing mission work? Like, your life looks different than someone who grew up in a church and is surrounded sort of by a Christian bubble.
Yeah, so my point is not simply about missions, it's about pastoral ministry. And I would think that would be especially important for a person who doesn't emerge from a Christian family and hasn't received that kind of discipleship, to be exposed to the spectrum of people that you're going to face when you are in pastoral ministry.
Ben, tell us a little bit about how does the theological model work at Farel, or like, how does it work? What courses do they have to take, and then how do they go about taking them? Is there internships? Are people doing other things at the same time? How does it work there?
Well, I'm new to the job, so I'm learning as we're going, and we're also in a kind of a transition at Farel. About 3 years ago, we reevaluated what we were doing in terms of resources that we had, human financial resources, in terms of the needs of the students. We have very few students. We don't even have a building built, so that we'd have to go to Tim Hortons to sit around a table together, which in some ways is good because then we're really in the world. But 3 years ago, we decided to associate it with an evangelical seminary here in Montreal, in Quebec City, but in Montreal, called the Faculté de Théologie Évangélique, so the Faculty of Evangelical Theology, which has basically Reformed Baptist confession. And we saw it as an opportunity where we could have our students following their program, but we as a institute, not as a seminary, but Farel as an institute or as a Reformed center, we offer other classes to supplement or even replace some of the courses that they would have at the FTE. So it's a model which, not ideal maybe. Maybe we'd like to have a whole program just Reformed theology, but our financial and human resources are such that we can't really. And plus, when we only have a couple of students, it's nice that they can integrate or interact with students from other church backgrounds. When you're in the Quebec mission, you can't just stay within the Reformed circles. There's just so few of us. I don't have any mechanic that I know that's Reformed. So I have to go to the local mechanic. The evangelism outreach opportunities we have, we don't have a lot of resources. So we work with the Reformed Baptist Church here in Quebec City, and we work with the Baptist group in order to do outreach and evangelism. We can bring in our Reformed colors. So it's the same thing in the seminary studies where our students are going to be interacting with evangelicals. They come with the Reformed convictions. We supplement with Reformed classes, both in terms of theology and practice internships. But they're going to need to also be able to articulate the Reformed theology vis-a-vis Pentecostal, Baptist, other convictions that are out there.
Is there like internships built into the...
Sorry, you did ask about the internships. Yes, there are. In fact, we're asking for more internships than the FTE would require. They require only one internship, but we have 2 internships that we would require. What we're recommending, and it's not fully adopted yet, but is 1 internship in a church which is established. And again, an established church here in the province of Quebec means they have probably 60 people or 100 people on a regular basis. And then another internship in a church plant or mission church or a church that's really struggling to try to get rejuvenated. So they have an experience in 2 different mission contexts, as well as former director and dean, John Zoller. He continues to teach a class in missions. And I think there's very few men who have such a good grasp of what it means to be missional, particularly in the French context. I think John's been here, some 40 years now. So he can impart to young students a great understanding of the Quebec mission.
Hey guys, I'm trying to piece together now, the various things that we've talked about. If we're asking a question, what's the relationship between theological education and missions? So a couple of things have come to the forefront. For sure, the theological education needs to equip the pastor or the evangelist who's doing full-time ministry, and that equipping happens in sort of the foundation of good theology on which they build, but it also ought to anyways equip them in order to think through things missionally and acquire skills that will help them on the mission field. Then the theological education in the local church is something that helps build up believers so that they lead this robust and attractive life so that when they do mission work, they're not just sort of being blown about in the wind, and they're, they've got their feet firmly planted in an attractive way. And so that can also link into them reading good things in their own language, publishing, the need to equip people theologically, and then the need to integrate ministry and preparation for ministry, integrate theological education and practice in everyday life, to try to figure out how to integrate those things well, whether those be through internships or whatever is going on in the lives of people who are being trained. Is there anything that I'm missing? Is there anything else that comes to mind when you think about the conversation we just had and this relationship between theological education and mission?
There's one thing that comes to mind, just how the pastor has to incarnate all that. And again, I don't want to, our pastors are not supermen, they're not Jesus, but they do need to be models for the congregation. So they need to be men who are solid in their theology, but also solid in their missional practice. They need to be the men who are doing outreach and evangelism on two levels, because it's pretty easy for us to do evangelism as a pastor wearing a pastor's hat, because this is our job. But even in their day-to-day life, just to the way they interact with their neighbors, the way they get involved in their community, the congregation needs to see the pastor as an evangelist on a day-to-day basis, because that will then give them not only an example, but also an encouragement to say, hey, I can do this too.
Excellent. Anything else that you wanted to mention, Bill?
I can't think of anything. I thought you gave a very good summary of all the things we talked about. And I thought that little bit from Ben was excellent at the end. And I endorse that entirely. The pastor should be the encourager and the instructor, but also the example for people, I think.
Well, I hope this conversation encourages people that are thinking about the ministry, training to be pastors, people that are in the ministry, but then also the everyday person in the pew, as they try to educate themselves and grow in their faith also intellectually, and to do that right where God has planted them, right where God has placed them in the mission field on their front step. Thank you so much, Ben, for being here. It's been great chatting to you.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation.
Thanks, Ben.
Bill, we've talked about seminary education a couple of times on this podcast, and it seems to me that if you cram everything that you want into the seminary education, you're going to have, a program that goes for 8 years or something. And so you mentioned in this discussion, it would be nice that people could be engaged in ministry, alongside their seminary education. Certainly, our own seminary is trying to get people to do internships that have a mission focus already. Do you think that we need to add more to that?
I'm not sure that we need to add more to it. If I were to look at the seminary curriculum, I might move some things around. I might remove some courses and add some courses and tinker with some syllabi. But really, the seminary education at the Canadian Reformed Seminary is already 4 years. I don't think we want to make it 5. But I think we do want to privilege missions in the curriculum, in the recognition that we are living and working on the mission field. And I'm not convinced that we're doing as good a job as we could be in that respect.
I sometimes wonder whether or not, I'm sure that if you talk to the seminary professors in our own Canadian Reformed Seminary or in various seminaries in the States, all of the professors will have a heartfelt love for the mission of Jesus and, reaching the lost. That's true without a doubt. But only some of them will have some real life experience with that, whether that be locally or overseas. And so maybe what we ought to do, instead of trying to increase the number of years or courses or something like that, is get all of our seminary professors to themselves do internships in mission context or in mission situations, whether that be overseas or locally. And I think that would just naturally then filter into how things go. So then you would have like I was privileged to have an Old Testament prof who, you're sitting there doing Old Testament exegesis, and at the end of the class has a bunch of comments about how this relates to mission work and how this relates to, church planting and, those type of things. I think that could be an interesting idea.
So just to understand you accurately, you are recommending internships for the professors.
Okay, that's a bad way to put it, but maybe that we would encourage them or give them opportunity to be involved in mission related activities so that they themselves can grow in that.
Well, I do think that it's a very good thing that so many of the seminary professors continue to preach in churches while they're teaching seminary students. I see that as something very, very positive. And I want to commend those professors who remain very, very invested in the church. And that's true of the seminary professors at the Canadian Reformed Seminary. I think it would be healthy, though, for such professors also to be embedded in missional opportunities, and maybe they are. I really don't know, but I see that as something healthy for sure.
All right. I sense that you're already starting to, write a proposal to a synod or something like that we incorporate this into, or to the board of governors of the seminary or something like that. Let's leave it at like this. This has been a good discussion. Thanks so much, Bill.
Well, Winston, we can always recommend an internship for all the professors at Jubilee Church in Ottawa. They would learn so much there, I'm sure. Thanks, Winston.
All right. See you, brother.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.